Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw. Okay, that's great. Lisa Goldman, thank you so much for joining me on Shooting It Raw. And as we talk, we'll get to know you. And we've known of each other a little bit, through your sister. I've always known about the great work that you do, and we've exchanged by email and never quite spoken. And so this is the first time we were actually talking to each other, and for me, it's a big treat, a real honor.
For me too.
Woohoo! So good. You're in Montreal, and I'm in Hong Kong. Is that right?
Yes, I'm in your hometown, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I moved to Montreal 3 years ago.
Oh wow, it's been 3 years already.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so let's work backwards. From before Montreal, where were you living?
I was in New York, but I was in New York before Montreal, and before New York, I was in Israel, and I basically, since I finished high school in 1984, I spent about 33 years shifting back and forth between Israel and New York, but not every couple of years. I would spend like a decade in one country and a decade in the other. So
Okay.
it's maybe a bit too much information, but yeah.
There's never too much information.
Yeah, back and forth. And each time I'd sort of come back to Israel or come back to New York after a very long absence. I'm not the kind of person who gets nostalgic for places and visits them frequently once I've left them. After I'd been away from New York from 1999 until 2011, I moved back, and I really hadn't been back very frequently. And it was just like coming home. But yeah, so Montreal. And then shortly after Trump was elected in 2016, the election of Trump in 2016 wasn't like the aftermath of that wasn't it wasn't the catalyst, but it sort of shifted the way I saw the world a bit. And all of a sudden I started looking around at my life in New York and thinking, can I afford to grow old here? You suddenly you wake up to the fact that you're middle aged, right? And I'd always lived this very sort of bohemian, unattached, unrooted lifestyle. I don't have children. I don't have a life partner, and New York really had. By then, I'd been back for 5 years, and I had a really nice, tight knit community of friends there, and I liked it there. But I was also starting to feel exhausted by how terribly depleting New York can be, and in many ways. It's also very, very expensive. And I sort of did some mental calculations, and I realized that, I'd be hitting if I stayed in New York, my earning power would never keep up with the cost of living. And I'd probably, I'd reach a point where I could no longer afford to rent an apartment, and I would never have enough to buy one. So I decided, okay, I better leave.
Right.
So I left, and I chose Montreal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, sweet. Okay, so let's go into the first photograph. Just so that, usually that's kind of how I end up connecting and learning more and just exchanging more with the guest. So in this case, the one is telling a story. So it's a black and white photo. And let me just describe it for the person listening. So it's a portrait of you. Very, very nice. You're just about, either you're suppressing a grin, or you are grinning, or you're suppressing a laugh. But, it's a real sort of heartfelt, humorous, honest emotion. The image is black and white. You're looking off to somebody to your, I guess it would be your left. You're wearing what's probably a cardigan, gray.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The background is blurred. It's a beautiful, soft, touching portrait. So why choose this one?
Well, I really like the way I look in that photo. It feels, it reflects the way I'd like to be perceived by the world in many ways. It was taken by a friend of mine in Tel Aviv. My friend's name is Idan Gazit, and he's a real amateur photography buff. He actually taught me how to use an SLR. And this photograph was taken in about 2009, 2010. And we were all sitting at a restaurant in South Tel Aviv that was very popular at the time. It served thali. It was called thali, and it served Indian, set menu Indian thalis, and everyone just sat on the floor. and ate. And it was a very relaxing atmosphere. And Idan had brought his camera. He was just taking random photos. And I was at that moment in the middle of telling one of my stories. I love to tell stories and, hit that punchline and sort of, how shall I say, not exactly massage the telling, but sort of, make the. I like to tell a story that makes people laugh and sort of makes them think, yeah. And so I was in the middle of telling a story. I don't remember what the story was, but he caught me just at the point where I was about to deliver the punchline
Mm,
of the story. Yeah,
nice.
and all of my stories are taken from real life experiences.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I think that kind of touches on an interesting point. Is that so? I had your sister on the podcast, and one of the interesting things that must have been in the water while you two were growing up, or it's definitely, I mean, from your mom, maybe I don't know, is that you both have a very clear, conscious self awareness of around social justice, but also around either is it righting wrongs or is it like figuring out how to it's a commitment I find that isn't very common, but is
Hmm.
you both share, which is really interesting.
Yeah, interesting you should say it. Hmm. So it's a very interesting question. First of all, we did not grow up in a political home at all. We never. I don't recall us ever having substantive political conversations in our home. Um, we were in this. I grew up in the 1970s and in Vancouver, and from the 1970s to the early 80s, and we were what I would call. We didn't call ourselves that then, but I would call ourselves. In retrospect, I would say we were Trudeau liberals, like we just axiomatically voted for the Liberal Party because I just felt like that's more or less what Jews did. I really don't feel that any particular worldview was imparted to us by my mother. My mother was a very self-absorbed person. She sort of had a lot of personal pain from her own childhood, and she was quite, she had many many loving qualities which I extol on social media every year on her birthday. She died in 2011 of cancer when she was just shy of her 68th birthday, and we had a very difficult relationship, and I think most of that was just because she was a very she had a tough childhood of her own, and she just had a lot of problems with not loving herself very much. And I think that it was partly because of that Adina and I are so conscious of our environment and of not thinking only about our own pain, but about thinking of other people. I suspect, and Adina might disagree with me, but I suspect that's partly rooted in a reaction against our mother, who was, by the way, a very very kind and generous person to her friends. Like, her friends will speak to you even a decade later. People will speak endlessly about my mother's generosity. She would really go to extraordinary lengths on behalf of people who, if they needed money or a favor, she would really go to extraordinary lengths for them. Um, but in terms of social justice, I don't recall us ever talking about that. However, I will say that years after I moved to Israel, and I first moved to Israel when I was 17. And even when I went to Israel for the first time in my mid-teens with my Jewish youth group, I remember being very, very conscious of political injustices around me that my peers were oblivious to. And I do not know exactly where that came from, but I suspect, since I now realize, going back to the theme of acquiring wisdom toward middle age, uh, what I've learned is that as you get older, you understand where your political, that if you have vehement politics in like terms of activism, or committing yourself to some kind of political work, it usually is an expression of very primordial and personal, it's and personal points, feelings, so I think that most people who make a really solid commitment, often to the exclusion of personal fulfillment, which is not the case with me, but sometimes it can be for some people. I think that that's often, compensating for, it's not compensating, but it's an expression of some kind of personal something that comes from the way they were conditioned at a very young age.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that we're both very conscious of the society, of our place in the world and how we affect others and how they affect us, and making the world a better place as a reaction to the way we were raised.
Okay, that's
Does that make
okay.
sense?
Yeah, well, look, I think part of what's cool about these conversations, like the podcast, is that we get to dive. I'm not psychoanalyzing you, but it's
Yeah.
a cool conversation, I find, to turn to somebody and say, okay, what do you really care about?
Mm.
How do you and the frame that I'm using is, how can we talk about something, or about how you see the world, how the guest sees the world, in a way that
Mm.
inspires other people. And so,
Mm.
and of course, I'm curating the group by asking people who I think have something interesting to say. And so,
Right.
for example, I have a very strong social justice bent as well. And to a certain extent, I have a slightly similar growing up childhood, like growing up in Canada to, I mean, my parents emigrated from Israel, and,
Mm.
going to Israel young and being aware of what's around me and being sensitive to the politics, but then going back to Canada and having that juxtaposition reveal, oh, okay, wait a second, the world is really messy and things are very complex.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, you could argue that Israel is itself a country trying to figure itself out, and so there's a lot of tensions inside in terms of ironing out problems, or the challenges, the social problems, the political problems. But what I find really brave and interesting about you is that you, to use an Israeli phrase that is very, I love so much. You went into the juice of the garbage. במיץ של הזבל.
I did. האמיץ של הזבל, נכון. Yeah, I did. I did. Uh, yeah, I did. Go on.
Is this? I know, and we're going to get into that. So, should we segue from this photo of you in Tel Aviv to the next photo? Because
Yeah.
would that open up that door, or will we get to there later? Like,
I don't know which.
so is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting